In the dream, you are standing in a cathedral made of mirrors. Each one reflects not your face, but the pain of someone you have loved. A weeping child, a screaming mother, a broken man with your voice. You try to find yourself, but the deeper you look, the more you disappear. And maybe that's not just a dream. Maybe it's a memory. You have always been able to feel what others don't say. Their rage behind smiles, their grief behind jokes. You call it empathy. They call you kind. But no one ever asked what it's doing to you. Because what if your gift was not a gift at all? What if it was a survival reflex, forged in childhood rooms where silence was loud and love had conditions? What if empathy was not something you were born with, but something you had to become just to stay safe? And now, you carry sorrow that does not belong to you. You bleed for people who never asked you to. You have become the mirror and forgotten the person who used to stand in front of it. This is not compassion. This is psychic exposure. This is possession by pain that is not yours. Carl Jung once said, "What you fail to make conscious will rule your life as fate." But this is not fate. It is a pattern, a haunting, a warning. And if you don't name it, you will keep calling it love. They call you gifted, sensitive, healing. But what if that's exactly what makes you the perfect prey? Empaths don't walk through the world, they absorb it. Every look, every tone, every flicker of emotion around them enters their nervous system like electricity through copper. But this sensitivity, this open channel, does not just attract kindness, it attracts predators. Because in a world shaped by manipulation, your empathy is not protection, it's bait. Those who lack empathy, narcissists, manipulators, and emotional parasites, are drawn to it like wolves to an open wound. They study your softness. They listen to how gently you speak, how quickly you forgive, how deeply you care. And they see a resource, not a person. To them, you are not a soul. You are a source of psychic fuel. The narcissist, for example, is not just egotistical. They are empty. They survive by pulling energy from others. And the empath, you offer it freely. You absorb their anger. You take responsibility for their chaos. You console them when they hurt you, not because you are weak, but because your nervous system was conditioned to prioritize harmony over selfhood. This is how the unconscious contract begins. You pour energy into their shadow, and they give you the illusion of meaning, of connection, of being needed. But it's not a relationship, it's a transaction, and you are the one bleeding. Carl Jung warned us, the unconscious does not care about fairness, it only seeks energy. And when you are unaware of your own psychic boundaries, your empathy becomes an invitation to be used. You become the battery that powers other people's survival. Their unresolved rage becomes your anxiety. Their inner child becomes your project. Their guilt becomes your identity. And by the time you realize it, you have built your entire self around someone else's damage. This is the empath's paradox. You attract the very wounds you are still carrying. You call it a connection, but it's a reenactment. Because unconsciously, part of you believes, if I can heal them, maybe this time someone will finally choose to heal me. But they won't. Because they don't want to be healed. They want to be fed. And you, if unconscious, become the meal. We live in a culture that romanticizes sensitivity. You've seen it. Empathy is praised on Instagram, painted in pastel fonts, celebrated like a superpower. But the truth, the one no one posts about, is this. Empathy without self-awareness is not kindness, it's surrender. Real empathy, raw, unfiltered, embodied, is not gentle, it's violent. Not toward others, but toward the self. Because when you feel everything, but don't understand why, you stop being a person and start becoming a sponge. You take on pain that doesn't belong to you. You absorb dysfunction and call it compassion. And slowly, your sense of self begins to rot from the inside out. Here's what they never tell you. Empaths don't just feel emotions, they merge with them. And that merging, when done unconsciously, leads to a kind of psychic enmeshment. You're no longer just feeling for someone. You're carrying their emotional ghosts in your nervous system. And you don't even know it. You find yourself sad. But it's not your sadness. Anxious, but nothing happened to you. Heavy, but the weight doesn't have your name on it. This is not healing, it's possession. According to Jung, the unconscious is a living force, and it doesn't knock politely. It seeps in through every crack in your identity, every unexamined belief, every boundary you didn't know you were allowed to have. That's how shadow projection works. Someone who has repressed rage, they meet you, and unconsciously deposit that rage into your field, not out of malice, but out of psychic reflex. And if you're unaware, if you're unguarded, if you've never been taught what your energy feels like apart from others, you'll absorb it, carry it, cry over it, and believe it's yours. You'll apologize for moods you didn't create, fix problems that never belonged to you, and lose yourself while trying to help everyone else find themselves. This is the shadow side of empathy, the one no one wants to talk about, because it's not beautiful, it's brutal, it's lonely, and it leaves you asking one terrifying question: who am I when no one needs saving? Carl Jung did not speak of empaths the way we do today. He spoke of psychic permeability, of individuals who were not merely emotionally attuned, but wide open to the collective unconscious, often without knowing it. He warned us, the unconscious is not just individual, it is archetypal, and it seeks expression. The empath, in Jungian terms, is not simply sensitive. They are an unwitting vessel, a carrier of other people's unloved parts, and that's where it becomes dangerous. Archetypes are not just metaphors, they are ancient autonomous patterns of energy that live below your identity. The mother, the child, the shadow, the savior, the trickster. These forces don't ask permission, they enter through emotion, through repetition, through trauma, and when someone disowns their own archetypal energy, when they repress their rage, fear, guilt, or grief, it doesn't vanish. It spills into the people around them. It seeks a vessel. The unconscious wants to be felt, and the empath is available, open. So the unloved rage of one person finds a home in your nervous system. The grief someone refused to mourn finds tears in your eyes. The shame they buried becomes a silent pressure in your chest. This is what it means to carry ghosts. It never announces itself. It creeps in like fog, blurring the line between what is yours and what isn't. Suddenly you're exhausted after phone calls. You avoid crowded rooms. You cry when no one says anything sad. You're not just feeling with people, you're feeling as them. But that's not empathy. That's archetypal contamination. And it has consequences. One of my patients, a deeply attuned artist, once shared a dream. She was walking through a museum made of stone. Inside, sculptures of people she'd loved, her mother, her partner, her friends, stood motionless. Each had a small plaque that read, "Do not touch, property of the dead." But she touched them anyway, and each one began to bleed. When she woke, she was sobbing, not from fear, from recognition. She had become a psychic necromancer, constantly reaching into the pain of others, trying to bring them back to life. But in doing so, she lost herself. Many empaths carry more than just personal pain. They carry ancestral wounds, emotional burdens passed down like heirlooms. The great-granddaughter of a village healer may now feel haunted in crowded rooms. The son of a war survivor might feel guilt for being at peace. Without ever being told the stories, they feel them, and they confuse it for their own suffering. This is the cost of empathy without boundaries. You don't just feel others. You become a host for the ghosts they refuse to face. And the longer you stay unconscious of this exchange, the more your own soul becomes a storage unit for pain that isn't yours. Jung didn't tell us to shut down our sensitivity. He told us to make it conscious, to know what moves through us, and where it comes from. Because until you know who's speaking through your emotions, you'll never know which feelings are actually yours. Empaths are not born soft. They're shaped by the storm. Long before they were called gifted, they were children trying to survive in homes where silence was louder than words, where love was conditional and peace had to be earned. Not by speaking, but by sensing. Imagine a little girl who learned to read her father's footsteps before he opened the door. The sound of his keys told her if tonight was safe or dangerous. And if it was dangerous, she'd shrink her energy, soften her voice, and try to become invisible. She became sensitive, not because she was spiritual, but because her nervous system adapted like a soldier in enemy territory, or a boy whose mother cried behind closed doors. No one explained, no one taught. But he learned. If he made her laugh, she stopped weeping. So, he became the clown, the light, the fix. But inside, he was carrying shadows he didn't understand. Not because he chose to, but because no one else would. These are not soft beginnings. They're forged in emotional war zones. And this is where empathy is born. Not in the heavens, but in the gaps between what a child needed and what they had to become to get it. They learned to scan for danger by reading energy, to soothe others to feel safe themselves, to feel everything as a way to stay ahead of pain. And later, they were told it was a gift. Wow, you're so intuitive, so emotionally aware, a natural healer. But no one saw the cost. No one saw the little body that learned to flinch at silence. No one saw the child who mistook emotional labor for love. That's how trauma wears a mask. Empathy becomes the pretty word for hypervigilance. Intuition becomes the polished name for a survival strategy. Sensitivity becomes the identity you hold onto because it once kept you alive. But if you never question it, if you never look underneath the label, you'll keep performing the same role in every room you enter, the caretaker, the soother, the one who feels everything so no one else has to. That's not empathy, that's entrapment. Because the truth is, your gift may have been born in brilliance, but it was shaped in fear. And until you heal the part of you that learned to survive by overfeeling, you'll keep confusing exhaustion for purpose and self-erasure for love. It begins slowly. You don't even notice it happening. You offer help. You give your time. You listen to their chaos, absorb their sadness, hold space for their storms, because you're the healer, the one everyone turns to when things fall apart. But what no one tells you is this: healers bleed too, and most people never ask where your wounds are. You start forgetting what silence feels like, what peace feels like. You're always on, always processing, always holding, always making sure everyone else is okay. And somewhere in that constant giving, you begin to vanish. Not all at once. It's subtle. You stop saying what you really feel. You let small things slide. You tell yourself it's just empathy, that being good means being quiet. But what's really happening is that your identity is dissolving. Not because someone demanded it, but because you learned to make yourself small enough to fit inside everyone else's pain. You shapeshift. You become who they need. You become the therapist, the emotional regulator, the peacekeeper. And then one day, you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. You've become everyone's lighthouse, but your own soul is lost at sea. This is the hidden cost of being everyone's healer. You're always needed, but never truly seen. People appreciate what you do for them, but they rarely ask who you are without the doing. And maybe neither do you, because the role becomes addictive. There's comfort in being essential, in being the one who understands. But comfort is not connection. And being irreplaceable is not the same as being loved. To be needed is not the same as being seen. And if you're not careful, you'll spend your whole life pouring into others, just to die thirsty. Empathy is not always an act of love. Sometimes it's an unconscious performance. And behind that performance are ancient forces, archetypes, that slip into the psyche and wear your identity like a mask. Carl Jung called them autonomous psychic energies, not invented by us, but inherited. They live in the collective unconscious, waiting for the right wound to animate. And for the empath, that wound is always open. The most seductive of these is Chiron, the wounded healer. In myth, Chiron was immortal, yet carried a wound that could never heal. He became a teacher, a guide, a healer to others. But he himself could never find peace. This is what happens when you build your identity around other people's pain. You serve, you heal, but beneath it all, you bleed, and you've convinced yourself that your suffering is the price of your purpose. Then comes the martyr, the one who sacrifices everything and calls it virtue. You cancel your needs, abandon your desires, drown in others' emotions, and feel morally superior for doing so. But it's not sainthood. It's self-erasure dressed up as compassion. Then there's the savior, the empath addicted to fixing. You chase broken people like puzzles, believing your love will save them. And when they hurt you, you call it a lesson. You stay. You try harder. Because somewhere deep inside, you've confused being chosen with being needed. And finally, the most dangerous one, the puppet. The empath who has become so entangled in others' emotions They're no longer acting from free will. They feel what others feel, want what others want. Their strings are pulled by moods, guilt, and unspoken expectations. They're performing empathy, without realizing they've lost all sovereignty. Each of these archetypes distorts empathy. It stops being an act of presence and becomes a role, a mask, an addiction. Because when your worth is tied to how much pain you can hold, you will keep seeking pain, just to feel valuable. This isn't compassion, it's entrapment by myth. And until you name the archetype moving through you, you can't reclaim yourself. Not every empath is a victim. Some are unconsciously in control, because when you don't heal the part of you that needs to be needed, your empathy becomes something else entirely. It becomes a performance, a strategy, a subtle form of power. You say you're helping, but deep down, you're holding the emotional leash. You give advice no one asked for. You fix people who didn't ask to be fixed. You listen with intense compassion, but feel betrayed when they don't change. That's not empathy. That's control masquerading as care. You've learned to play the savior so well, you don't even notice when you're crossing their boundaries, because you think you're doing it out of love. But sometimes, love is just fear in a nicer costume. Fear of abandonment, fear of irrelevance, fear that if you're not helping, you're not valuable. And so, you overgive, you overfeel, you overfunction. Not for them, but for you. Helping becomes a mask, care becomes control, empathy becomes a currency. You offer emotional labor in exchange for closeness. You absorb pain in exchange for worth. You make yourself essential, then wonder why people lean on you until you collapse. This is the trap of spiritual codependency, where your identity is built not on connection, but on emotional transactions. You're not loved, you're used and thanked. And that thanks becomes your drug. If you're honest, some part of you may feel powerful being the one who understands, the one who always gets it, the one others come to for comfort, wisdom, clarity. But that power is fragile, because the moment someone sets a boundary, you feel abandoned, you feel punished, you feel erased. And that's when you realize your empathy was not unconditional. It came with invisible strings. Until you face this shadow, you will keep confusing control for compassion and performance for purpose. Dreams don't lie, they don't flatter, they don't romanticize your suffering the way your ego does. They show you what your waking self is too afraid to admit. A man once dreamed of standing in a cave. Inside, he heard voices, people he had loved and lost. A child clung to his leg. A bleeding stranger sat at his feet. A woman reached out from the shadows, her hands trembling. He tried to run, but he couldn't. His feet were rooted in the ground. And then a whisper came from the darkness. "You made this your temple." He woke up in tears, not from fear, but from understanding. He realized he had built his entire identity around carrying others' pain. He didn't just feel for them, he lived inside them. He turned his body into a shrine of sorrow and called it purpose. Another woman dreamed of a room full of mirrors, but every reflection showed someone else's suffering. She searched for her face, her truth, but she couldn't find it. That's what happens when you make empathy your identity. You reflect everything except yourself. This is how the unconscious speaks, not with logic, but with symbols, not with language, but with shadows. It shows you the contracts you never knew you signed, the promises you made in pain. If I carry their wounds, maybe I'll be loved. If I bleed with them, maybe I won't be left. These dreams aren't punishments, they're invitations. To see your empathy for what it's become, not a gift, but a temple built from suffering. Every empath reaches this point, the moment when reflection is no longer enough, when mirrors shatter, when dreams shake loose something deeper, when being the healer no longer feels holy, only heavy. This is the descent, the fall from the pedestal you never asked to stand on, the unraveling of the mask you didn't know you were wearing. To individuate as an empath is to peel back every layer of identity that was built to be needed, appreciated, praised. It is to ask, without flinching, who am I when I'm not saving someone? You begin to see it. How often you've used empathy to avoid your own anger. How many times you've softened your voice to keep the peace that was never yours to protect. How many relationships you clung to, not because you were loved, but because you were useful. And beneath it all, rage. Not loud and explosive, but buried, old, sacred. The rage of having carried everyone else for so long and never being asked how much you could hold. The rage of being chosen only when broken. The rage of being expected to absorb, but never express. Next to that rage is something more fragile. Fear. Fear that if you stop giving, you'll disappear. Fear that if you draw a boundary, they'll leave. Fear that if you say, "I can't," no one will stay. This is the reckoning, the crucible, the moment where you choose to stop performing empathy and start embodying your soul. Because until you face the part of you that needs to be needed, you can't find the part of you that simply is, without offering anything. This is where the savior dissolves and the self begins. Empaths are told to be open, to feel deeply, to just hold space. But no one teaches them how to hold that space without disappearing inside it. No one teaches them the difference between being present and being consumed. This is the shift from sponge to vessel. A sponge absorbs. It soaks up whatever's around, dirt, sorrow, rage, until it's dripping with emotions that don't belong to it. Eventually, it molds, it breaks down. But a vessel holds. It has structure, it contains. It does not become what it carries. This is energetic mastery, not a cold wall, not detachment, but the ability to stay rooted in your own energy, even while sitting in someone else's storm. Boundaries are how you protect that energy, not with shame, not with guilt, but with sacred clarity. Because boundaries are not rejection, they are recognition. This is me, that is you. It sounds like, I feel you, but I do not become you. I witness your pain, but I do not house it in my body. I care for you, but I won't collapse for you. I will not bleed for you, but I will stand with you. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop absorbing everyone's wounds is the moment you finally become safe to be around. Not because you're empty, but because you're anchored. True empathy doesn't flood the room. It centers it. It says, I'm not here to fix you. I'm not here to carry you. I'm here to be so deeply myself that you remember how to be yourself too. That's the work. That's the upgrade. You are not here to be a sponge for the world's pain. You are here to be a mirror, clear, grounded, unshakable. A vessel of presence, not a victim of absorption. Unconscious empathy is absorption. Conscious empathy is alchemy. It's the difference between drowning in someone's pain and holding space for it without losing yourself. Between being the sponge and becoming the flame that transforms. When you're unconscious, you merge with others. You mistake their grief for your own. Their fear becomes your mood. Their chaos becomes your identity. But when empathy becomes conscious, something changes. You no longer carry the wound. You witness it. And in witnessing, you offer something far more powerful than rescue. Reflection. You're not absorbing the sorrow. You're illuminating it. You're showing someone a part of themselves they've never been able to see clearly, not by fixing, not by sacrificing, but by standing in your center and allowing their pain to rise, without swallowing it. This is the moment empathy stops being survival and starts becoming service. It's not codependent, it's not compulsive, it's clear, it's intentional, it's rooted in the understanding that you are not here to save anyone, but you can be the mirror that helps them recognize their own power. Empathy becomes healing, not when you take the pain away, but when your presence says, you are safe to feel this now. That's alchemy, not magic, not martyrdom, but the ability to stand in someone else's fire and not lose your shape, to feel without fusing, to love without losing, to care without controlling. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the ability to remain whole in the presence of chaos, not untouched, but unaltered. Conscious empathy is not soft, it's strong, it's sacred, it's the transformation of pain, without ever claiming it as your own. The unconscious empath becomes the martyr. They absorb, overextend, and eventually collapse. Not because they are weak, but because they've made pain their purpose. They bleed quietly, believing their suffering makes them worthy. They confuse exhaustion with empathy. They call their self-erasure love. But the awakened empath is something else entirely. They don't carry everyone's wounds. They don't beg to be needed. They don't build intimacy on sacrifice. They become the mirror, still, clear, unshaken. They reflect truth, not trauma. They don't lose themselves in another's sadness. They stand rooted in presence, and in doing so, they help others remember who they are, not by fixing them, not by bleeding for them, but by being so deeply themselves that it becomes a permission slip for others to do the same. A martyr disappears in service. A mirror reveals. And in that revelation, something sacred happens. The person in front of you sees not just their pain, but their potential. This is the shift, from rescuer to reflector, from overgiver to anchor, from emotional puppet to conscious presence. You are not broken for others' comfort. You are here to reflect what they've forgotten. You don't need to carry the world to change it. You just need to remember who you are when no one is asking you to be anything else. You were never meant to carry the world. You were meant to walk through it with open eyes, a steady spine, and a heart that feels, but no longer floods. Empathy was never the destination. It was the threshold, the doorway, the sacred ache that led you here. Because before the fire, you thought empathy was everything. You thought it meant absorbing pain, fixing people, being soft enough to be safe. But now you know, real empathy isn't about being consumed. It's about being conscious. You've stood in the storm long enough, not as a victim, but as a vessel, not to become the chaos, but to witness it and remain whole. You've carried archetypes through your bloodstream, the savior, the wounded healer, the child, the ghost. And slowly, you've set them down, one by one, until what remained was something quieter, but infinitely stronger. Now, when pain enters the room, you don't flinch, you don't drown, you listen, you reflect, and you remember you are not here to bleed, you are here to burn, with clarity. You do not numb yourself, you sanctify your sensitivity. You do not collapse for others, you stand beside them. You do not rescue, you reveal. This is what it means to become whole, to no longer seek worth through suffering, to no longer define yourself by how much pain you can carry, to finally come home, not to everyone else's needs, but to your own presence. Sanctify your sensitivity, or be swallowed by it. You are not here to be haunted. You are here to be human. And in becoming fully yourself, you give others permission to do the same, not through sacrifice, but through sovereignty.